So I don't know if you can tell by the face autofocus detect or the quality, but I have finally switched to the Sony a7S III from the LUMIX G7 after years and years of deliberation in trying to choose the right perfect camera to replace this one with. And I understand that these aren't a direct comparison at all, they're completely different price points, but since I spent so much time making this decision and finally switching to Sony, I thought I would just go over why I made this switch today, kind of go over the things I thought about in making this decision. And of course, this isn't the perfect decision. I'm not saying that you should switch to Sony or you should switch to full frame, but this is just kind of my thought process on why I ended up doing it. So I think this will be super interesting. So in a previous YouTube video, I received a few comments wondering why I wasn't switching to the LUMIX GH5, and I definitely considered switching to it, but at this point it's like a 4 or 5 year old camera, just too outdated despite it being a very good camera still. And then also I've been waiting for the LUMIX GH6 to come out for a really long time and it just wasn't coming out. There's rumors about it now, but it just wasn't happening, so I decided to skip that camera and just move on to a different system entirely. Now we definitely looked at a few other LUMIX cameras that are more updated, like the S5 or the S1H, things like that, but honestly there's just a few reasons why I didn't switch to them, and I'm gonna cover them now. Okay, so if there's one thing that LUMIX does very poorly, it is autofocus, and if there's something Sony does exceptionally, it's autofocus. And that was just something that was bumming me out when I was looking at these LUMIX cameras, especially the new ones. Even compared to my old LUMIX G7, the autofocus really wasn't improving, and it's pretty horrible on those cameras if you've ever used it. And it was just a little bit disappointing to be buying a brand new camera in 2021 that doesn't have good autofocus. So that was a big reason for me to go to Sony. So far I've just been blown away by the autofocus. It works at 4K 120 frames per second super quickly. It doesn't even make sense when you switch from LUMIX. So that was a big reason. And another reason that I switched from LUMIX to Sony is that I wanted a camera with a full frame sensor in it. I know that the S5 from LUMIX and some of their other cameras do have full frame sensors, but there's a specific reason that I went with Sony. So coming from the LUMIX G7 with a micro 4/3 size sensor, it's definitely a fine sensor size. It allows you to have smaller lenses and overall a smaller camera body, but the problems with it are that it is a small sensor, meaning that it doesn't have great low light performance. And then also, if you buy lenses for micro 4/3, you're not able to adapt them to a bigger camera if you purchase a bigger one in the future. So that was a really big dilemma I was having with LUMIX cameras, especially the G7, GH5, and future GH6, is that micro 4/3 is a fine sensor format. There's a lot of lenses, they're relatively cheap, but you can't use them later. So if you want to update in the future to APS-C or full frame sensors, you can't use the same lenses, you can't adapt them up. Whereas with a full frame camera and full frame lenses, you can adapt it down to micro 4/3. So I just thought I would make the switch now, save me some money in the future not to buy more micro 4/3 lenses, and just start updating my full frame lens collection. Now I do realize that the LUMIX S5 and some of their other bodies do have full frame sensors, but I didn't think the mounting type, the Leica L mount, has been developed very well. There aren't very many lenses for it, and there aren't very many third-party options, whereas the E mount on Sony has so many lens choices, so I just thought that was a better, more versatile option to go with. And the other thing about micro 4/3 sensors is that the low light performance is pretty poor. I mean, you really aren't going to be able to get that much light into a sensor that size, even if they optimize it and everything. And even the LUMIX S5 with the bigger full frame sensor doesn't have the best low light performance. Obviously it's better, but Sony absolutely blows them all out of the water. I got this shot last night at f2.8 with stars and a relatively clean image. Obviously there's some noise, but literally I can see stars in video mode. It's absurd. So that's definitely a reason that I wanted to switch. With run and gun filmmaking, it's just nice to have that great ISO performance, great low light, little noise, and just a good image overall. So again, that's another reason for Sony. Another big reason why I switched to the a7S III was just the recording modes. It's insane if you think about it, but it can shoot 4K 120 frames per second at 10-bit 422 no crop with autofocus. It's absurd once you try it. Like, there's no way you can ever go back. I was looking at the S5 from LUMIX, but it only shot 60 frames per second in 4K and it had an APS-C crop. So I don't know, for me at least, when you have an image that has to crop in to do a higher frame rate, it just feels like you're sacrificing something and it's not as premium. So with this 120 frames per second, 4K, you're not sacrificing anything and the quality is ridiculous. Now there are a few cons for switching from LUMIX to Sony. First of all, you're switching camera systems, so you have to get used to a whole new menu system, whole new camera system. It does take a little bit to learn it. Secondly, the in-body image stabilization on LUMIX cameras is pretty much unbeaten. They just have the best sensor shift technology, and they get really steady shots handheld with their sensor technology. The A7S III definitely has pretty good stabilization, definitely compared to their previous cameras, but it still doesn't really compare to LUMIX because it's just so smooth on their cameras. And then another con, which I hinted to earlier, is that none of my micro four thirds lenses work on the A7S III, of course, because it's micro four thirds to full frame, but it is just a bummer to have to switch from all these lenses that I've collected over time and have to sell them off, and they're not compatible, so I have to buy a whole new kit of lenses. So that's definitely something you want to keep in mind when you're switching sensor sizes, but it is a good idea to make the switch to full frame sooner than later. That's why I didn't stick with micro four thirds. I thought that the lenses and sensor and low light would become outdated pretty quickly, so I didn't want to stick with that system, but again, that's just personal preference. So obviously I'm really excited about the A7S III. It just has so much potential in my opinion. It has insane dynamic range. S-Log3 looks super good, pretty easy to color grade. I'm really liking the look that I'm getting with it, and then there's just all these other settings like the ISO that goes to over 400,000 and tons of little things in there that just make it look really good and cinematic. So anyway, this was just a quick little video on my thought process for why I switched from LUMIX to Sony. Let me know in the comments down below if you're thinking about switching cameras and what your thoughts are on these different cameras. But thank you for watching as always. I can't wait to use this camera in more videos and make more professional stuff. But give this video a like if you liked it, and I will see you all next time.